It's the mid-1960s. The United States is locked in a space race with the Soviet Union, and President Kennedy has thrown down the gauntlet: land a man on the moon before the decade is over. To achieve this incredible goal, NASA is building the most ambitious machine humanity has ever created. Enter the Apollo spacecraft, carried to the stars by the colossal Saturn V rocket, a 363-foot behemoth generating enough power to light up New York City. And somewhere inside the chaotic halls of the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory, a young computer scientist named Margaret Hamilton is quietly writing the software that will make all of this possible. Hamilton isn't your typical engineer. At a time when women made up only about 3% of the computing workforce, she was not just part of the team, she was in charge of the whole project. As the director of software engineering for the Apollo program, Hamilton and her team were tasked with an almost impossible job: write the code that would guide, navigate, and land the lunar module safely on the moon. A pioneer in a male-dominated field, Hamilton balanced her groundbreaking career with motherhood, often bringing her young daughter, Lauren, to the lab. As we'll see later in the video, this decision would unexpectedly shape the mission's success. Keep in mind that this was far from being a usual software problem. The whole Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC, had about 64 kilobytes of memory and operated at 43 kilohertz, or roughly 70,000 instructions per second. To put things into perspective, your smartwatch has more processing power than all of NASA during the Apollo era combined. What's more interesting is that the Apollo Guidance Computer didn't use memory chips like we have today. Instead, it relied on something called core rope memory, which was an incredibly strange but genius solution for the time. While it was revolutionary, it came with serious limitations. For instance, changing a single line of code meant they had to manufacture a completely new core rope memory unit, which was a process that took weeks. On the other hand, core rope memory was incredibly durable, and it could survive extreme temperatures, radiation, or the vibrations of a rocket launch. This is what made it perfect to run software on a spacecraft. For the interface, they used a numeric keypad and two-digit verb and noun codes associated with the commands and data. But despite all these hardware limitations, Hamilton wasn't intimidated. In fact, she practically coined the very idea of software engineering. The term software was barely even a thing at that time, but she insisted that software should be taken as seriously as hardware. In an era when coding was still seen as an afterthought, her take was considered a pretty radical and eccentric idea. Actually, Hamilton is sometimes credited with inventing the term software engineering itself. She used it jokingly at first to get people to respect the complexity of her work, and the name stuck. One of the most critical moments showcasing the brilliance of her work came during the Apollo 11 mission. As the lunar module called Eagle descended towards the surface of the moon, something went wrong and alarms started blaring. The rendezvous radar left on by mistake flooded the system with interrupts, triggering alarms that signaled an overload with too many tasks at once. To give you a perspective of the situation, imagine that if the system had crashed or frozen, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would have had to abort the landing with the mission being deemed a failure. But Hamilton's software was built to prioritize critical tasks. Instead of crashing, the Apollo Guidance Computer calmly ignored non-essential processes and focused only on the navigation and landing functions. Her team's priority scheduling system, a precursor to modern real-time operating systems, detected the overload and shed non-critical tasks, restarting the computer in a safe state every few seconds. In other words, the system knew how to fail gracefully, which is something that most modern apps are still not able to achieve to this day. Thanks to Hamilton's foresight, the Eagle landed safely on the moon. Armstrong's famous words, "The Eagle has landed," would never have been possible without the resilience baked into Hamilton's code. But the landing itself was far more chaotic than history books make it seem. As the lunar module descended, Neil Armstrong realized they were headed straight for a field of giant boulders. Taking manual control, Armstrong flew the Eagle horizontally across the surface looking for a safer spot, all while alarms blared and their fuel reserves rapidly dwindled. By the time they touched land, the lunar module had only about 20 to 30 seconds of fuel left. Any longer, and the abort sequence would have triggered, forcing them back into orbit. This wasn't the first time Hamilton's software quality was put to test. During Apollo 8, the first mission to orbit the moon, the AGC flawlessly navigated without ground support when the moon's far side blocked radio signals. This proved that Hamilton's code could handle the unknown. But you might still not get a sense of the achievement. The Apollo Guidance Computer software was printed out and bound in thick volumes to visualize the scale of the project. In one famous photo, Hamilton is standing next to the stack of printed source code, and it's literally as tall as she is. That's roughly 145,000 lines of assembly code written in a low-level language called AGC assembler with none of the high-level tools available to programmers today. Every line was meticulously crafted on coding sheets, punched onto cards, and tested on a simulator that often failed because the hardware couldn't keep up. The team used manual version control, tracking changes through documentation and physical card decks under constant pressure to meet Kennedy's deadline. Hamilton's leadership unified dozens of young programmers, many inexperienced, who often slept at the lab to keep up. The team even had to account for things no one had thought about before, like what would happen if an astronaut accidentally pressed the wrong switch during the landing. After realizing that human error could easily sabotage a mission, Hamilton designed software that could recover from bad inputs without crashing the system. Funny enough, Margaret's daughter, Lauren, actually helped inspire one of these critical error handling routines. During simulations, her daughter would playfully mess with the command module's controls, highlighting how even tiny mistakes could lead to disaster. Margaret saw this and insisted the software must be bulletproof even against human error. Hamilton's team worked directly with astronauts to simulate mission scenarios, ensuring the software aligned with real-world needs. What's more interesting is that the MIT lab used a hybrid simulator with a physical cockpit and analog computers to test the AGC software. This simulator was so advanced that it could mimic the moon's gravity and the lunar module's dynamics. In many ways, Hamilton's approach to building robust, reliable systems was decades ahead of its time. Today, terms like fault tolerance, priority scheduling, and asynchronous programming are seen as best practices. Back then, they were pure survival instincts needed to put a man on the moon safely. Despite her massive contributions, Hamilton's work went largely unrecognized for decades. It wasn't until much later that she began to receive the honor she deserved. In 2003, she received a NASA Exceptional Space Act Award, and then, in 2016, President Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Staying true to her style, Hamilton never made a big fuss about it. In interviews, she often says she simply loved solving hard problems, and that the real reward was seeing the astronauts return home safely. Today, Margaret Hamilton is considered one of the foundational figures in computer science. She didn't just help land humanity on the moon, she helped define what it means to be a software engineer. Her code lives on, and NASA open-sourced the Apollo 11 guidance software in 2016, allowing enthusiasts to run it on emulators and admire its efficiency. And in a world where software quietly runs everything from phones to cars or spaceships, Hamilton's legacy is more alive than ever. The AGC software influenced subsequent NASA projects, including the Space Shuttle and modern spacecrafts like the Orion capsule, which owe their fault-tolerant designs to Hamilton's innovations. From a young woman writing code at MIT to a pioneer whose work helped shape the future, Margaret Hamilton's story is proof that sometimes the people who change the world aren't the ones shouting the loudest, they're the ones writing the code that makes it all work. If you enjoyed this dive into tech history, check out some of my other videos. Until next time, thank you for watching.